Hello, everybody. Glad you came here. I have to be honest, I didn't expect this much people here for this specific session, so I'm very happy to see you all here. Before I start completely, I'd just like to do a quick stat test. How many of you, can you raise your hands? How many of you have less than 3 years of experience in Drupal? Okay, and over 3 years? Okay, quite a few then. It's a nice sample. So my session today, writing code, both science and art. I'll be discussing code standards. I feel that this is something that's often overlooked in the community. I see a lot of code, be it in core or in contrib, that lacks some of these aspects that I'll be covering today. And when I go into some custom codes, the effects of that are even worse, actually. Just before I start, let me introduce myself. My name is Jan Zavrl. I'm a senior Drupal developer at NDP, which is a London-based Drupal development studio. You can find me on these areas that you can see. So my Twitter handle is Jan Zavrl, my Drupal username is jzavrl, and my website is as stated above. You can always find me anywhere with these these handles. So first off, coding standards. Not many people know what they are, that they even exist. Every community, every technology, every software pretty much has its own set of coding standards. And what they are, they're basically just rules, expectations on how the code will look, how the code should behave, on how the code should be written and formatted. With this, we have two types of coding standards. One is the style, and this just relates to how the code actually looks like. So the formatting of the code, spaces, tabs, etc., stuff like that. And the second one is substance. This one relates more to basically the best practices that you use when you're developing your own code or when you're contributing to core and contrib modules and stuff like that. So, and also why is coding standards important that you know them and that you follow them? I'm not sure how many of you remember, but Drupal passes the so-called truck test. For those who don't know this, it's basically, it passes the truck test because if you have a developer and something happens to that developer, a truck goes over him, there's a next developer that can come in because, you know, Drupal's a large thing. There's the community, a lot of people who are working on it and stuff like that. So whenever you're writing some code, there's a very good chance that somebody else will come in and take a look at your code. And it's very important that they know, based on the coding standards, they know what to expect in the code that you wrote. So that's why it's important to understand and go by these coding standards. And in short, as it says, you're writing your code for the guy next to you or for the guy after you. Whatever you write, the chances are that somebody else is going to come in and take a look at the code, be it the next day, the next week, or maybe 2 years from then. Coding standards are also important for another reason, which is automating API documentation. I'm pretty sure not all of you know what this actually means or what it is, but there's a module on Drupal.org, which is called API. And it basically scans all of your modules that are in contrib, even in core. And if you wrote the code inside those modules properly by the coding standards, commenting the code, using whatever stuff you need to use in there, The module will scan all of that and automatically generates the API documentation that you need. So whenever you're browsing Drupal.org for the API documentation, whatever you see there is actually generated by this specific module. So let's go on first with the basics. Like I said, coding standards consists of two types. One is the style and one is the substance. This part is just going through the style. So coding style and formatting, indentation, spaces, opening tags, line wrapping, and stuff like that. So with Drupal, we use 2 spaces for indentation. Some of you may see a tab that is being used, or 4 spaces. With Drupal, you should use 2 spaces. Any opening tags, this is more related to PHP. So any opening tags should be there, no closing tags with PHP files, and you should always end with a blank line. Then another important thing is line wrapping and length. Length of your code should not surpass 80 characters inside your code editor. And if it's longer than that, you should restructure it or reformat it so it goes inside those 80 characters. Now, what's a good thing about this, the basics, the coding style and formatting, is that pretty much about 60 or 70% of this stuff that you see here can be achieved automatically by configuring your code editor properly. And just by doing that, you, like I said, you already accomplish about 60 or 70% of the coding standards needed to work in Drupal and to write code that abides by the Drupal coding standards. This is just a few examples that I'll be showing throughout the whole session, just basically to make my point and to demonstrate on the stuff that I'm trying to accomplish and say here. So what I have here is just 2 blocks of some code. It doesn't really matter what it does. But on the top code, I use the original code and it's formatted as it should be. And on the bottom code, I just removed all of the spaces. And as you can see already, the bottom code is a little less readable. And this is just by removing the spaces. Not to mention that we could have, for example, on the 3rd line, we could still just go on the same line and we would surpass the 80 characters. The array could be in the same line, and then the save would be also in the same line. So we could have, I don't know, 3 times the limit of the characters that is available or that is needed for the coding standards. Okay. Sorry about this. Okay. So next thing are the control structures. You use them quite a lot. Every code has them. If, switch, try statements, for loops, for each loops, anything that is there. The good thing is that for coding standards, it pretty much has the same rules for each of these control structures. So if you just remember one of them, then it's very logical and simple to use them on every other control structures that you write. There are some exceptions with writing these structures in templates, which I'll be showing some examples about. So this is the first one, which is an if statement. So you can see the use of spaces and new lines for the keywords. So just going line by line. The first line, you start off with the if, of course, and then you have the spaces around the parentheses. inside, you should always use spaces when you're comparing something, some variables, or you're doing something with your variables, whatever it is. You should always use spaces wherever it's possible, after a comma, after the equal signs. It doesn't really matter. It just makes the code a lot more readable. Then you have the next keyword that comes after it, either be else if or else. It needs to go on the next line, always. It doesn't really matter what your control statement is. Each new keyword in that statement should go into a new separate line. Then you have the else if, which is a bit more of an exception in the Drupal coding standards. Normally you would see the else if written separately with a space between the else and the if. With Drupal coding standards, that should be all together. Then we have the switch statement. Again, it's a pretty familiar logic like I just described before. You should have the spaces around the parentheses, spaces before the opening curly bracket, and then indent any child logic that goes beneath it. So you have the next one is the keyword case, another space, and then the value that you're comparing it to, and then the logic which you do for that specific case statement. Every case statement that ends with a break should then continue with a new empty line. So you can see we have the break keyword, and then a new line, and then the new case comparison. Even before the default one, and you don't need an empty space. Well, you shouldn't do an empty space before the closing curly bracket. We have the try statement. Again, pretty familiar stuff. You have the spaces before the opening curly brackets. You have the catch new keywords on your new line, and then again the use of spaces and indentation. I could very easily put this code, maybe just mess it up a bit. Don't use the new lines, some spaces put out, and you would have a lot more difficulties reading this code. And just imagine somebody else coming in and taking a look at this code. You might know it, but the other guy that comes in will be a bit more confused about the whole thing. Then, like I said, the templates have a bit of an exception. Now the left side is actually a Twix template, which I'll discuss Twix a bit later on down the road. But the more important thing is the right one, where you could see that the if statement is a bit different than it is inside the PHP files. So with this one, you don't have the opening and closing curly brackets, but you do use the colon to stop your keyword. So you have the if space and then the variable definition or the variable comparison inside your parentheses, and then another space after the closing PHP brackets. Why? I mean, you could still use the normal ones. It would work, but it would make also the code a lot less readable. And with this approach, you can just easily separate the PHP logic from the markup, and it's very much a lot more readable and a lot more maintainable. Now with arrays, I'm going to a bit more into detail about the arrays in Drupal 8. As some of you might already know, the arrays have just accepted a new coding standard rule that you should now write the short array syntax. So that is, instead of writing the array keyword when you're defining or using the arrays, you should just use the square brackets. And then arrays can be put into multiple lines or single line. Now, the single line can be used if you could put it inside your 80-character limit of the line. If not, you should put it into several different lines, use your keys and values, and things like that. And then there's also the trailing comma question, which I often see being misplaced. So if you use a single line array, you should not put a trailing comma behind your last key value inside the array. But if you use a multi-line array, every line should have a trailing comma at the end. So an example like just I've described, so you can see there's no array keyword when you're defining the array. There's just the square brackets. And then you have 3 values inside of course the first array that you're seeing. And the last keyword does not have a trailing comma at the end. Now the second array, if we were to put this into the same line, obviously this would go beyond the 80 character limit. And because of that, we've put both of the values into each line, and also put a trailing comma behind the last one. As you can see, it's not the case with the first array, but you should definitely put it in case of a multi-line array. Naming conventions. It doesn't really do much with the functionality of the code, more of readability. And it's also important that you use them consistently. So variables, this is PHP variables, should be used as snake case or lower camel case. Now, if you look at Drupal coding standards webpage, there's no clear definition on which one you should use, but it is important that you are consistent with your choice and you don't mix these up. And not just yourself, but the whole team that's working on the same project. So don't mix snake case or lowercase. Just go by one and stick to it. Constants should always be uppercase. Even the default provided constant in PHP, such as true or false or no, yes, those are constants, and they should be all used uppercase. Also with Drupal 8, now you should be defining constants as with the const keyword instead of the define, as it was the case with Drupal 7. And even in the defining of the constants, you should be using uppercase, as well as where you are manipulating or using the constants throughout your code. Next are classes, which is something new that Drupal 8 came with. I mean, not new, but it's used a lot more now than it was in Drupal 7. Sure, Drupal 7 had some classes, but not that much. Either way, you should use upper camel case for all of your classes that you define or use. The class names should not have the Drupal keyword inside of them, because that's reserved obviously for the core ones. And you should always suffix your classes with test or interface, obviously wherever you are defining a test or an interface class, an interface. Then methods, which are inside your classes or interfaces, as well as properties, should always use lower camel case. Now, I can't really stress this enough, because this is the second thing I'm seeing too much of it in the code that I'm looking at, reviewing, or working on, is the lack of comments. You should always comment your code no matter what, even if it's a function that's maybe just returning a value, you should comment that, especially with functions that you do or methods that have, let's say, 100 lines of code in it and does some logic and whatnot. You should use the file doc block. You should use the add file comment. This one comes with exceptions, which I'll be showing you an example later on. Functions and methods also use the doc block. And then you have also some exceptions with functions, which are the hook implementations. You don't really need to completely do a doc block if you're doing a hook implementation, which I'll show an example later on. Then you've also got the @inherit_doc. You might have seen this now in Drupal 8. I'll also be showing some example of that. Basically, this comes from implementing interfaces in Drupal 8. And then you've got inline comments, which you should also use quite frequently. Not for every line. I mean, if you just define a variable, or say a variable is 1 + 2, you don't need to comment that. But if you do have a couple of lines of code and it does something inside there, then you definitely should comment it. Why is that? I mean, when you write your code, obviously you understand what it does, or maybe you even forget it later on. That's why it's important that you comment all of your code, what it does, even in specific breakpoints inside your code or functions or methods. You should put some inline comments, just quickly, briefly describing what it does. It's going to be easier for you when you, let's say 2 years from now, when you write that code and you could go back into your file and code editor and open that up, you'll see comments. You'll be thankful to yourself 2 years back. So these are 2 examples of the doc block. So the first one, like I already said, is the add file. You should always use an add file doc block as starting every file. You should just briefly describe it as to what it does. Again, keep in mind the 80-line character limit that you should be using. Now, I've also said that this one comes with an exception, which has just been accepted as of recently in the coding standards. And it states you should always use the add file doc block unless you have an interface or a class that has a name which is the same as the file name. So, for example, you have a file name called foobar.php, and you are declaring a class named foobar. In those cases, you should not use the add file doc block. And then you have the method or the function doc block, which is an important one because with this one, you can clearly define what the function or the method does, what kind of parameter is it accepting, and what kind of return, or basically what does return back when you use that function. So in the first line, you should just briefly describe what your function does. It should always be, the first line should always be just a single line, a quick description. If there's need to describe your function a bit more into detail, this is where the second part comes in. So you should put a blank line in between that, and then you can write whatever you need to write about the whole code, about the whole logic that you have inside, and then separated with another blank line, you have your parameters described. So whatever parameters the function is accepting, you should define them here with the add param keyword. You should then state what this parameter is of type. So in the first one, we see it's a field item interface field item, and you should also hint it inside the field. Inside the function parameters. So as you can see right below, you see the field item interface item, and this will also show an error if you use your function or method that with a parameter that is not of this specific type. After that, in a new line and also indented by 2 spaces, you should just briefly describe what this parameter actually is and maybe even what it's going to be used for. And you go on with all of the parameters that you have for this. And then with another blank line, you should define an add return keyword and write about what the function will be returning. Again, you should write your type that's going to be returned, and then a brief description about what this specific class or whatever you're returning is. Now, you've also noticed probably, or not, with the parameters that are described in the comments, the type that this parameter should be is defined as the whole namespace of that specific item. That is what you should do. And inside the function itself, where you are defining the parameters, you should just use the class name. So as you can see in our example, the first one is Drupal core field item interface, and then inside the function itself, you just see the field item interface. So another two examples where you are only having the hooks implemented. You don't need to write your whole comment or comment doc block for your hook implementations. You should just write implements and whatever hook you are implementing in this case. You could also write what this hook implementation is for, and maybe just a brief description. It's not really required, more of an encouragement if you have a file with a lot of hook implementations. But if you just write the implements and which hook, you're already doing a great job. Now, next two things which I have are CSS and JavaScript. I won't be going into too much detail, especially with CSS, because whatever I've just told you now, especially with the style coding standards, it pretty much applies the same to CSS. So, like I said, it's very similar to default formatting. You should again use 2 spaces for indentation, 80-line character limit, etc., and so on. Then there are two things that maybe are a bit more related to CSS. So we have new lines between rule sets. There's a bit of a dilemma about this, and some of them are using it, some of them are not. But the basic rule of thumb is that when you have a rule set that are related to each other in some sort of way, maybe you are, let's say, styling a form, and the first rule set is styling the field, and the second one is styling the submit button. If you're doing those, then you can put them one by one with no new lines in between. But if you have a style, a rule set that are not related at all, then you should use a new line between those rule sets. Again, comment your code, especially with the file. The file one, the add file doc block is a bit more important. And also some inline comments if they are necessary, if there's some, maybe a hack that you did, or maybe something more specific or advanced in the CSS that you had some difficulties writing down, make sure you comment that, either be it for yourself or for anybody that comes in and takes a look at that code, so they have a very clear understanding at what does it do. Now, JavaScript in Drupal, here I'm seeing a lot more substance code standarding issues, not so much in the styling ones. Again, the styling is pretty much the same, indentation, new lines at the end, and stuff like that. But what worries me more is the use of JavaScript code in Drupal. I very regularly see stuff like not closing your files, so you've got global variables, using global variables, which is even worse, and then not using the provided Drupal behaviors, once functions, which are, I think, are extremely important. If you've ever had issues with JavaScript and maybe Ajax stuff in your Drupal, it's most likely because you've misused or haven't used the proper stuff that Drupal is providing you. So again, the add file doc block at the start of the code, a new line, and then you've got your function closure. What this actually does is it just closes whatever you do inside of it for this specific file, and it's not going to be available to any other code that's outside of here, and you can't manipulate it, you can't use it, you can't write variables that are defined in your file and stuff like that. Then we have the function declarations. I often see just a regular function like you would see in, say, jQuery or JavaScript, simply with the function and then the function name, function parameters, and stuff like that. If you do that, that is wrong, and you should use the Drupal keyword and then attach a function to that Drupal keyword object. The Drupal keyword object is going to be available every time you use the proper closure. If I can go back up. So the Drupal keyword that you can see in the second parameter, that's the one that is being provided to you by Drupal. And you can also access various other functions or variables that Drupal is setting and lets you use them. So you should use it like this. Again, there's a doc block on the top of it, which you should always put. Just a brief description, new line, set of parameters, the parameter type, and then the description of the parameter. And then when you declare the function, so like I said, use the Drupal keyword object, attach a new keyword, which is your function, preferably prefix the function with your module name. This is going to make your life a lot easier if you're doing a lot of functions and some of them might collide with the functions that are provided already inside the Drupal object. Then you have the function, space around the parentheses, the parameters that this function accepts, and then you put your logic inside your function. Now this one doesn't really return anything specific, but somehow a rule of thumb is that you should be returning at least something, maybe even true or false, because I mean this specific function just does something to the existing variables and sets some values on it, but wherever you are defining or declaring your own function, you should be returning something at the end. Next one is the behaviors. This is a very important thing in Drupal that I often see overlooked, and many JavaScript functions, files lack the behaviors. Basically, what the behavior is a set of code that does something to the DOM elements. It might be your, let's say, quickly, you do a carousel plugin inside and you attach all of that carousel plugin stuff onto a specific element. Now, you could easily do this without the behaviors, without the attach function and whatever you see in here, and just use the document ready. But the issue comes in, like I said, if you do a lot of stuff with Ajax, Drupal automatically reapplies all of this logic whenever Ajax is run on maybe even on the same element. So you'll get a lot of calm in your mind just by using this, and a lot of unspent hours trying to debugging your code why something breaks suddenly after an Ajax is running on your site. Now with Drupal 8, we got Twix, which is a new templating engine. The coding standards are again pretty similar to the Twix ones. You do have quite a bit more stuff that you can do with Twix. So I mean, you can loop over data that was the same as you had before with PHP. But you also have some filters that you can now use, which is a bit let's say, a bit different logic than what we have in PHP, but it pretty much accomplishes the same thing. And again, you should not use any logic in your Twig template files. I often see this, and it's wrong. It shouldn't be there. Use a preprocess function for that. So here's an example on looping over the data inside your Twig templates. As you can see, the double curly brackets in the middle are there for rendering whatever element do you have. And then you have the, I'm not even sure how this one's named, but it's curly bracket percentage, which is there for any control structures that you are doing. So in this case, it's a for loop that loops over the containers inside the container variable. And then for each of these containers, it outputs whatever is inside of it. So a div with a class layout column, and then it renders the blocks. In Twig templates, you also have the add file doc block, which again is important because you also get a lot of stuff in your Twig templates, or even the core ones that you use. Normally you see this Twig comments inside the core templates, but you should also define your own ones whenever you are creating a new Twig template. So just to go quickly over these. So the first one, again, briefly describes what the template is about, a new line, and then you define what are the available variables to you inside this Twig template. This is very useful for the themers to quickly overview whatever they can use inside this Twig template, because not all of them might be outputted inside the actual Twig template itself, but it's good to know that they have something else available for them already to use. And then at the bottom, again, separated by a new line, you have the add C statement keyword, which says that the template preprocess block is the function that you should take a look at, which lies in core. And this is the function, the preprocess function, that defines all of these variables that you see on the top. And then you've got the add in-group keyword, which is a bit of a mystery for some. But what this does is it basically just describes that this specific Twig template file is the original one. So if you have a block Twig template, it's going to have the add in-group keyword at the end. But then when you extend or when you copy this specific Twig template into your own theme, you should remove that, because that's not the original template anymore. So it just describes that this template is actually being overridden by the theme, and it's not the original core one or the contrib one. Again, if you're implementing your own theme functions, which come together with your own Twig files, you should use a doc block like the one you just see now, and also include the add in-group themable at the end, which states that this is the original Twig template file. Now there are some differences in object-oriented code that came in. So with classes and interfaces, I've already described the naming conventions that you should use. There are also not that much, but some things that you should take a look at and be careful about. They won't really break the code, but it is something that you should follow. So any classes and interfaces that are defined should, right inside, should start and end with a new blank line. And after that, you can then define all of your methods and properties. Now, methods and properties, again, the naming convention has already been described, but you should also know that properties should normally be set to visibility. You should set a visibility on the properties, and it should not be public. So either set it as protected or private. Now, for those who don't quite understand why private or protected, private just, this just defines that the properties cannot be available publicly when you instantiate a class. And you should then, for every properties that you do have, you should set up public methods that do something with this specific property. Now, you also have the translate function and the dependency injection. This is more of the substance coding standards. So with the translate function, there are some differences against Drupal 7 that we do have now. So the Drupal 8 version, if you are in a class, you will always have the T method available inside the same class. If not, which is again possible, you should just use the translate string trait, and that function or method will be then available. Now you also have placeholders inside your translate functions, which are @variable, %variable, and colon variable. All of these do something with the variable that you put in. So the @variable just checks or cleans up the variable, so you have a plain text. The percentage variable does the same thing, but it outputs it as emphasized text. And then the colon variable, which I think is new with Drupal 8. I don't think this one was available with Drupal 7. But basically, this one should be used whenever you are using any links inside your translate functions. Then we have the dependency injection. Dependency injection, I think it's large enough to have its own session about it, but I just want to say, if you are in a class or an interface, you should use dependency injection. Never use the static calling of the Drupal services. Always use dependency injection. It makes, let's say, life a bit more easier, and also the code can then be properly tested. So just some quick examples on how the classes should look like. So you have the namespace and the use statements above. All of them should have a blank line. And then the class declaration, a blank line, and then the protected functions, the public function, the public methods. And then when you stop with the class, you should always put a blank line in between. Again, use the doc blocks, even for just for the protected variables. The properties. You should define what the property is and just describe the type of the property. So with the first one, you see it's a string, and with the second one, you see it's a block plugin collection. It's much easier then to read the code this way, and you know what you could be expecting when you are getting or setting this specific property. Again,
we are out of time, so.
I think I'm about a minute out. Okay. This is just a quick one on how the dependency injection should look like. Like I said, you should always use it. You just need the construct and then the create methods, which will get you the services, and then the services will be defined on one specific property of the class. Again, some examples for the T. For the translate function with the placeholders. So you've heard my session. Now, what can you do to go on and basically write better code? You can set up your code editor, which is something that you can instantly do, and you can achieve about, I don't know, 80% of coding standards just like that automatically. Also use Coder and Code Sniffer. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically it's a plugin that sniffs your code and checks if you are up to the correct coding standards. And like I said, just by formatting your code properly using your code editor, it comes a long way. But most importantly, what I can say is be consistent. Be consistent to yourself, be consistent in your team, define something, go to some coding standards and use them, be consistent. Because simply making it just work doesn't cut it. You do need to write proper code for the guy next to you and for the guy after you. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, we can go over them now. If not, you can nudge me outside. I'll be here the whole week. You already know my handles for to reach me. Thank you.